Everyone in the restaurant gasped when the sharp ripping sound erupted. The sudden noise cut through the warm evening like a blade. All heads turned toward the source near the middle tables. There stood Lena, the young waitress, holding her torn apron sadly. Her hands trembled as she tried to understand what just happened. The cloth dangled helplessly while guests stared in shocked silence. Madame Celeste, the wealthy guest, glared with cold, burning anger. She had grabbed the apron and ripped it without any mercy. She believed everyone in the place existed only to serve her wishes. Her voice rose sharply, filling the room with cutting, disrespectful words. She accused Lena of being slow, even though Lena had hurried constantly. The workers nearby froze, too afraid to challenge the powerful customer. Lena tried to explain softly, but her voice shook with fear and shame. Celeste moved closer, ignoring everyone and leaning forward with a mocking smile. Her expensive bracelets clicked as she pointed angrily at the trembling waitress. She shouted that no one should dare make her wait even one moment. The customers began whispering, nervously unsure how far the scene would go. Some felt sorry for Lena, who had worked all day without complaint. Others watched because Celeste was known for dramatic outbursts everywhere she went. Lena lowered her eyes, wishing the ground would swallow her completely. Celeste lifted the torn apron piece and waved it like proof of crime. Lena whispered an apology, even though she had done nothing wrong at all. Celeste ignored the apology and demanded the manager come immediately to her table. The manager hurried over, his face tight with worry as he approached the scene. Before he could speak, Celeste announced that she refused to sit anywhere near Lena. She claimed the service was terrible, although every guest knew that was untrue. The manager tried to calm her, but Celeste continued shouting without pause or control. Lena stepped back, feeling small, as if the entire world was watching her break. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, wanting to help but too scared to interfere. Celeste demanded a new waitress immediately and ordered her drink remade 3 times. She accused Lena of ruining her evening, even though nothing serious had occurred. Lena swallowed hard, holding back tears, as whispers spread through the crowded room. She wondered why someone with so much wealth would choose cruelty over kindness again. The other servers moved cautiously, afraid they might become the next target of anger. Celeste continued complaining about the chairs, the lighting, and the music without stopping. Her voice echoed loudly, bouncing off the walls like a storm refusing to pass. Lena tried to breathe steadily, reminding herself she needed this job to survive. Every second felt heavier as Celeste's rage grew instead of calming down slowly. The guests hoped someone would step in before things became worse for Lena again. Yet no one expected what would happen next as the restaurant door suddenly opened. A strong, quiet presence entered the space, making the air shift with silent tension. The bright lights reflected off the polished marble floor as footsteps moved inside slowly. Customers turned their heads, sensing an important arrival, even before seeing the newcomer clearly. Lena wiped her eyes and looked toward the entrance, wondering who had come in. Celeste crossed her arms, annoyed that attention was drifting away from her dramatic display. She demanded that everyone stop staring at the door and focus on her complaint again. But the energy inside the room had changed, and something powerful was approaching steadily. Lena felt a strange mix of fear and hope rising as the footsteps grew closer. Guests held their breath, expecting someone important, maybe someone who could end the chaos. Celeste noticed movement. The restaurant grew strangely quiet as the tall figure stepped inside. A soft breeze followed him from the night outside, carrying the faint scent of rain and city lights. People leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away, as if something important was about to happen. Lena stood frozen, still holding the torn apron in her shaking fingers while her heart beat faster with every step the stranger took. Celeste noticed the shift in the air, and her eyebrows pulled together in irritation, because she hated losing attention even for a second. The guests whispered to one another, trying to guess who had arrived and why the atmosphere suddenly felt charged like electricity before a storm. The stranger moved with a calm, steady walk, and his expression remained unreadable, yet powerful in a quiet way. That made everyone stop talking. He wore a simple dark suit, but somehow it looked more valuable than anything Celeste was wearing, even though she had covered herself in jewelry. Lena blinked slowly as he drew nearer, and something inside her heart recognized the familiar shape of his shoulders and the gentle, quiet way he moved. At first she thought she must be imagining it, but then another part of her whispered that this was real, that he was truly here. Celeste finally turned toward the entrance, annoyed that the room was no longer watching her, but when she saw the man, her irritation slipped into confusion. She stared at him, trying to place his face somewhere in her long list of wealthy friends and famous contacts. Yet nothing came to mind, and that annoyed her even more. The manager stepped back as if giving the newcomer space, sensing something important in the air, even if he could not explain it. The guests watched with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next as the man continued walking toward the center of the room without speaking a word. Lena felt her breath catch in her throat as memories rushed back the times she had waited for him after long business trips, the quiet evenings they shared, the promises they made to each other before life pulled them in different directions. Her fingers tightened slightly around the torn apron as she wondered why he was here without warning, and why he chose tonight of all nights to walk into her workplace. Celeste straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and tried to reclaim control by pretending she was not affected by his presence, but inside she felt uneasy, because something about him made her heart skip with warning. The man finally stopped beside Lena, and the room seemed to breathe again, though softly, as if afraid to break whatever moment they were witnessing. His eyes moved to the torn cloth in Lena's hands, then traveled upward to her face, where sadness and embarrassment mixed together like stormy water in a shaken glass. He spoke her name gently, his voice smooth and warm like a calm wave rolling onto sand. "Lena," he said, and her eyes widened as the sound of her own name coming from him wrapped around her heart like a sudden embrace. The guests looked at each other confused, because they expected him to approach Celeste, the wealthy, loud woman, not the humble waitress with the ripped apron. Celeste blinked rapidly, unable to believe that this important, powerful-looking man was speaking to the girl she had insulted and humiliated in front of everyone. She pressed her lips together and watched closely, trying to understand the connection between them. The man turned his attention toward Celeste next, his expression remaining calm, but his eyes becoming sharper, like glass catching direct sunlight. The guests felt the tension rise again, not in the chaotic, loud way from earlier, but in a slow, heavy way that made everyone sit up straighter. The man asked in a quiet, steady voice what happened here, and why Lena's apron was torn, and why she looked so distressed. Celeste lifted her hand immediately, ready to spin her story and make herself sound innocent, but something in his gaze made her hesitate, as if lying might be dangerous. Lena looked down, embarrassed, because she did not want to complain or create conflict, especially in front of so many people. But before she could speak, one of the customers stepped forward, nervously raising a hand. The customer explained that Celeste had grabbed the apron and ripped it herself while screaming at Lena for no real reason, and the manager opened his mouth to add something but closed it again, unsure what to say. Celeste snapped at the customer, telling them to mind their own business, but the words came out shaky, lacking the confidence she usually carried. The man listened quietly, his calm expression never changing, yet his silence felt heavier than anger, because it carried disappointment and warning together. Lena felt tears forming again, not because of fear this time, but because his presence reminded her of safety, something she had missed deeply without admitting it. She wondered if the guests could feel the same change she felt inside her chest, a shift from fear to something warmer and steadier. Celeste sensed she was losing control of the situation and tried to smile sweetly, reaching toward the man as if they were equals, but he stepped back slightly in a polite yet clear rejection. The gesture shocked her, because she was used to people chasing her approval, not avoiding it. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the man addressed her, directly calling her madam in a voice that sounded both respectful and cold at the same time. He asked her calmly why she believed she had the right to touch his employee, let alone damage her clothing and embarrass her in public. The guests gasped again, and even the lights in the restaurant seemed to flicker as the weight of his words settled across the room. Celeste stared at him, unable to respond, at first her mind spinning with confusion and fear because she suddenly realized this was no ordinary man, and the situation was no longer under her control at all. A heavy silence filled the restaurant as every pair of eyes focused on the three people standing at the center of the room. Celeste forced a stiff smile onto her face, though her hands shook slightly as she tried to hide her growing fear. The man's calm expression unsettled her far more than shouting ever could, because his silence felt powerful, like a warning she could not ignore. Lena stood quietly beside him, still holding the torn apron close to her chest while her heart pounded fast like a trapped bird trying to escape. She felt small under all the attention, yet she also felt a strange sense of safety, simply because he was there near her again after so long. Celeste cleared her throat loudly, trying to regain the attention she thought she deserved, and she lifted her chin to speak. She began explaining the situation in a dramatic voice, claiming Lena had been rude and slow and careless from the very beginning of the evening. The guests rolled their eyes and exchanged knowing glances because they had witnessed every moment, and none of it matched Celeste's twisted story at all. The man listened without interrupting, his face still quiet, but his eyes growing sharper like ice, forming thin cracks across a frozen lake. Celeste noticed the change and quickly shifted her story, blaming the manager, the kitchen staff, even the lighting, anything to protect herself from guilt. The manager stepped back, feeling nervous as Celeste tried to drag him into her lies, but he dared not interrupt the tense moment unfolding before him. Lena lowered her gaze, wishing the ground would swallow her, as Celeste's voice grew louder and more desperate. Each word from Celeste sounded less believable than the last, and the guests murmured softly, judging her behavior with raised eyebrows and tightened lips. Finally, the man lifted one hand slightly, a small gesture that instantly silenced Celeste mid-sentence, as though someone had cut her voice from the air. His calm voice returned, asking again for the truth, but this time the weight behind his words felt heavier, more demanding, and impossible to escape. Celeste stepped back one tiny step, almost unnoticeable, yet everyone saw it, and the room felt it like a shift in gravity. She tried to laugh, the sound thin and shaky, as she claimed everything was just a misunderstanding, a simple mistake, nothing serious at all. The man lowered his gaze to the torn apron, then back to Lena's frightened expression, and his jaw tightened slightly, showing the first sign of anger beneath his calm surface. The guests leaned forward, sensing the moment was building towards something important, something no one wanted to miss. Lena opened her mouth softly, ready to speak for herself, even though her voice felt weak and unsure, but the man gently placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her as if saying she did not need to defend herself anymore. The simple touch made Celeste's stomach twist with confusion, because she could not understand why he acted protectively toward a waitress she saw as beneath her. She tried once more to regain control by smoothing her dress and smiling in a way she believed was charming, but her eyes darted nervously around the room, revealing her panic. The man asked again for the security footage in a quiet, steady tone, and the manager nodded quickly and hurried toward the back of the room, his hands shaking with pressure. Celeste grabbed the nearest chair to steady herself, suddenly aware that the truth she had tried so hard to hide was about to be displayed in front of the entire restaurant. The guests whispered excitedly, their curiosity growing stronger with every second as they waited for the manager to return with the footage. Lena tried to steady her breathing while she wondered how much worse things might become for her, even though she had done nothing wrong. Celeste, meanwhile, searched the room desperately for anyone who might support her version of the story, but every guest avoided her gaze, unwilling to be dragged into her chaos. When the manager finally returned carrying the small device that held the recording, Celeste's heart dropped like a stone falling into dark water. The manager looked apologetically at Lena, then glanced nervously at the man before setting the device on the nearest table for everyone to see clearly. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the screen, while the guests leaned in holding their breath as the footage began to play silently. Celeste felt her knees weaken as the recording revealed exactly what had happened, her angry gestures, her sharp words, her sudden cruel grip on Lena's apron, every detail captured without mercy. Lena watched the screen with a mix of sadness and relief because the truth was finally visible to everyone. Not twisted, not hidden, simply honest. The guests gasped softly as the clip ended and turned their eyes toward Celeste, waiting for her reaction, yet expecting nothing good. Celeste's face had drained of color, her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no sound came out, only a broken whisper of panic. She looked desperately at the man, hoping he would show mercy, but his expression remained unreadable, though disappointment darkened his eyes like a shadow. Lena felt her heart tighten painfully as she watched him watch Celeste, because she sensed he was preparing to speak, and whatever he said next would change everything inside the room. The guests waited, their bodies tense, their hearts beating with suspense as the man took one slow, quiet breath before finally turning toward Celeste, ready to give his answer. The air stilled around them as though the entire restaurant was holding itself together, waiting for the moment that would decide what came next for all of them. The room felt tighter as everyone waited for the man to speak. The air itself seemed to pause in fear and curiosity. Celeste stood stiff like a statue, her fingers curled around the back of a chair, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The guests watched her carefully, some with judgment, others with quiet disbelief. Lena kept her eyes lowered, but her mind raced, wondering what the man would do next and how far this moment would go. The torn apron felt heavier in her hands than before, as if it carried the weight of every emotion inside her chest. The man finally faced Celeste, his calm voice holding a sharp edge, though he spoke softly. He said that what he had seen on the footage was not a misunderstanding, not an accident, and not something that could be excused with simple words. The crowd leaned forward, wanting to hear every detail, as though the entire evening had built up to this moment. Celeste tried to interrupt, but her voice came out weak and thin like paper tearing under pressure. She attempted to blame stress and the long day she had, but her excuses sounded hollow in the heavy silence of the room. The man stepped closer, his presence steady and unmoving like a wall she could not push through. He told her that the recording showed clear disrespect and cruelty, nothing more and nothing less. Celeste's eyes widened as she realized she could no longer twist the truth, and she looked around, desperately hoping someone would defend her, but every gaze avoided hers. The guests had already seen the truth with their own eyes, and none were willing to lie to protect her. The manager swallowed nervously, waiting for the man's next words, while Lena stood frozen, unsure what she should do, if anything at all. The man asked Celeste why she believed she could treat people this way, as if their feelings did not matter and their dignity could be torn as easily as fabric. Celeste's lips shook, her breath unsteady as she tried to speak, but no clear answer left her mouth. For the first time she looked small instead of powerful, and the guests saw fear growing in her eyes like ink spreading in clear water. The man turned briefly to Lena, his voice softening as he asked if she was hurt even in the slightest. Lena shook her head quickly, though her heart still trembled with leftover fear and shame. She felt overwhelmed by the attention and wished the moment would end, but she also felt thankful for his presence, for the way he stood beside her like a shield. Celeste watched the gentle tone he used with Lena, and confusion twisted deeper inside her stomach, because she knew that tone was not used by a stranger. The man shifted his gaze back to Celeste, his eyes steady and unblinking. He said the situation could not end without consequences, because actions like hers caused real harm, and ignoring them would allow the same cruelty to happen again. Celeste opened her mouth wide in disbelief as she clutched her expensive bracelet like a lifeline. She tried once more to defend herself, saying she only reacted out of frustration, but the manager quietly stepped forward, shaking his head. He explained that Lena had done everything right, that she had been polite, patient, and gentle with every request. Celeste snapped at him, ordering him to stay out of it, but her voice cracked with fear. The guests could feel the tension growing thicker like storm clouds gathering overhead. A few whispered that this was karma, a long time coming for someone who treated others with constant disrespect. Celeste felt trapped, as if every pair of eyes in the room shined a bright, unforgiving light on her mistakes. She looked at Lena with a strange mix of anger and panic, almost begging her silently to say something to ease the moment, but Lena remained quiet, unsure what to do. The man stepped forward once more and reached for the device that had shown the footage. He turned it toward Celeste, forcing her to look directly at her actions replaying for a second time. Celeste flinched as she watched herself grabbing Lena's apron, yelling, pointing, and tearing the cloth without pause. She looked away quickly, but the image stayed burned in her mind, her own cruelty staring back at her without kindness or excuse. The man told her in a low, steady voice that pretending this had not happened would not protect her, and that lying again would only make things worse. Celeste's knees bent slightly, and she sank into a chair as fear finally took over all her false confidence. The guests murmured softly, sensing that the moment of truth had finally arrived, and that Celeste's downfall was no longer avoidable. Lena felt her heart grow heavy watching Celeste crumble, even though she remembered clearly the pain and humiliation she had felt just minutes before. Part of her did not want revenge, she only wanted the moment to end so she could breathe freely again. The man glanced at Lena, reading the emotion in her eyes, and his expression softened, before turning fierce again as he faced Celeste. He said she owed Lena a real apology, not a fake one filled with excuses, but an honest acknowledgement of the harm she caused. Celeste looked stunned, as if she had never imagined needing to humble herself in front of a crowd, especially for someone she believed beneath her. She shook her head slowly, whispering that she could not do that, but the man responded that she no longer had a choice. The entire restaurant waited breathless as Celeste stared down at the table, her pride fighting her fear, her ego pushing against the truth she could no longer deny. And as the silence deepened, she realized she was standing at the edge of a moment that could reshape everything she believed about power, respect, and consequences in ways she never expected. The room felt heavier than before as Celeste sat trembling in her chair. Her pride tried to keep her upright, but fear kept pulling her down. The guests watched her closely, waiting to see if she would obey the man's demand for an honest apology. Lena stood quietly beside him, unsure what would happen next, and unsure if she even wanted Celeste to speak at all. The torn apron hung from her fingers like a reminder of everything that had happened tonight, every harsh word, every cruel gesture, every moment she had tried to stay strong. Celeste lifted her eyes slowly, but the man's gaze made her look away again, as if she had stared into bright light for too long. She whispered that she did not understand why he cared so much about a simple waitress, and her voice cracked with disbelief and confusion. The man took a slow breath, his expression softening for one short moment, before hardening again with quiet strength. He said there was something important Celeste needed to know, something she should have considered before choosing cruelty over kindness. The guests leaned in, their curiosity growing again like a flame catching new air. Lena blinked nervously as she looked up at him, sensing something troubling shifting in his voice, something she never expected to hear tonight. Celeste stared at him, confused, her eyebrows pulling down as she tried to find a reason for his strange protective behavior. She asked him gently, almost fearfully, why this mattered to him in such a personal way, why he stood in front of Lena like she meant more than a simple worker ever should. The man turned toward Lena fully now, and a quiet sadness appeared in his eyes, as if he had carried a heavy truth for a long time. He said Lena was not just an employee, not just someone serving tables in a restaurant filled with strangers. He said Lena was someone important to him, someone he respected, someone he valued far beyond what any of them could see. The guests gasped softly as the energy in the room shifted again, becoming warmer and deeper, yet filled with new tension. Celeste felt her stomach twist painfully as she stared at him and whispered if he was trying to say that Lena was special to him in some personal way. The man nodded slowly, and the room seemed to stop breathing as he finally said the words he had kept hidden until now. He said Lena was his wife and had been his wife long before anyone in the room ever met her. A wave of shock rippled through the restaurant, causing guests to cover their mouths and whisper loudly to one another, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Some said they guessed something was special between them, others said they never imagined such a humble waitress could be married to a man who carried such power and quiet dignity. Lena felt her breath vanish completely, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum struck too hard. She had not expected him to reveal their relationship so openly, especially not tonight in front of strangers, and certainly not in front of the woman who had humiliated her. Celeste went pale as snow, her mouth falling open as she struggled to breathe in the thick air. She stared at Lena, now seeing her differently, no longer as a helpless girl in an apron, but as someone she should never have touched, someone who stood far above the cruelty she had thrown at her. Her hands shook as she whispered that she did not know, that she never imagined. Lena had such a connection, such a life beyond the apron she wore. She begged the man to understand her confusion and forgive her mistake, but her excuses sounded weak and paper-thin. The man stood tall beside Lena, as if forming an unbreakable shield around her. He said her ignorance was no excuse because kindness should not depend on someone's status or wealth or title. He said if Celeste had chosen respect from the beginning, she would not be standing here, now trembling under the truth she could no longer run from. The guests murmured in agreement, feeling the weight of his words inside their hearts. Lena felt tears forming, but they were not from sadness this time. They were from the overwhelming shock of hearing him call her his wife again after months of distance and silence. She remembered the arguments, the misunderstandings, the long nights when she wondered if he still cared, or if they would ever find their way back to each other. She never expected their reunion to happen like this, surrounded by strangers and humiliation, yet also by truth and quiet strength. Celeste fell to her knees suddenly, the sound of her jewelry clattering against the floor, echoing through the silent restaurant. She begged Lena for forgiveness, her voice shaking like a leaf in harsh wind, saying she did not know, she did not mean to hurt someone so important. She repeated the words again and again, hoping they would bring mercy, hoping the man would soften his judgment, hoping Lena would save her from deeper disgrace. Lena stepped back, overwhelmed and unsure how to respond, because she had never seen Celeste so broken, so desperate, so small. The man looked down at Celeste with cold sympathy and told her that the apology needed to be real, needed to be spoken clearly, and without excuses in front of everyone she had embarrassed and frightened earlier. Celeste nodded weakly, swallowing her pride like a bitter stone, because she finally understood she could no longer escape the consequences of her own hands and her own heart. And as the guests watched the scene unfold, their eyes filled with shock and emotion, they sensed the story was far from over, for tonight had only begun to reveal the truths that hid beneath the surface of every action and every word that had led to this unforgettable moment.